Chapter 37 of Colonel Quaritch, V.C. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Colonel Quaritch, V.C. by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 37. Sister Agnes. 10 days had passed, the tragedy of which the foregoing is a record had echoed through all the land. Numberless articles and paragraphs had been written in numberless papers, and numberless theories had been built upon them. But the echoes were already commencing to die away. Both actors in the dim event were dead, and there was no pending trial to keep the public interest alive. The two bodies, still linked in that fierce, dying grip, had been picked up upon a mudbank. An inquest had been held, at which an open verdict was returned, and they had been buried. Other tragedies had occurred. The papers were filled with the reports of a noted and remarkably full-flavoured divorce case, and the affair of the country lawyer who committed bigamy and, together with his lawful wife, came to a tragic and mysterious end, began to be forgotten. In Boisingham and its neighbourhood much sympathy was shown with Bella, whom people still called Mrs. Quest, though she had no title to that name, but she received it coldly and kept herself secluded. As soon as her supposed husband's death was beyond a doubt, Bella had opened his safe, for he had left his keys on his dressing table, and found therein his will and other papers, including the mortgage deeds, to which, as Mr. Quest's memorandum advised her, she had no claim, nor indeed had her right to them been good in law. Would she have retained them, seeing that they were a price wrung from her late lover under threat of an action that could not be brought? So she made them into a parcel and sent them to Edward Cossey, together with a formal note of explanation, greatly wondering in her heart what course he would take with reference to them. She was not left long in doubt. The receipt of the deeds was acknowledged, and 3 days afterward she heard that a notice calling in the borrowed money had been served upon Mr. de la Molle on behalf of Edward Cossey. So he had evidently made up his mind not to forego this new advantage which chance threw in his way. Pressure, and pressure alone, could enable him to attain his end, and he was applying it unmercifully. Well, she had done with him now. It did not matter to her, but she could not help faintly wondering at the extraordinary tenacity and hardness of purpose which his action showed. Then she turned her mind to the consideration of another matter, in connection with which her plans were approaching maturity. It was some days after this, exactly a fortnight from the date of Mr. Quest's death, that Edward Cossey was sitting one afternoon brooding over the fire in his rooms. He had much business awaiting his attention in London, but he would not go to London. He could not tear himself away from Boisingham, and such of the matters as could not be attended to there were left without attention. He was still as determined as ever to marry Ida, more determined if possible, for from constant brooding on the matter he had arrived at a condition approaching monomania. He had been quick to see the advantage resulting to him from Mr. Quest's tragic death and the return of the deeds, and though he knew that Ida would hate him the more for doing it, he instructed his lawyers to call in the money and make use of every possible legal means to harass and put pressure upon Mr. de la Molle. At the same time he had written privately to the Squire, calling his attention to the fact that matters were now once more as they had been in the beginning, but that he was, as before, willing to carry out the arrangements which he had already specified, provided that Ida could be persuaded to consent to marry him. To this Mr. de la Molle, notwithstanding his grief and irritation at the course his would-be son-in-law had taken about the mortgages on the death of Mr. Quest, and the suspicion that he now had as to the original cause of their transfer to the lawyer, had answered courteously enough, saying what he had said before, that he could not force his daughter into a marriage with him, but that if she chose to agree to it he should offer no objection. And there the matter stood. Once or twice he had met Ida, walking or driving. She had bowed to him coldly, and that was all. Indeed, he had only one crumb of comfort in his daily bread of disappointment, and that hope deferred which where a lady is concerned makes the heart more normally sick, and that was, he knew his hated rival, Colonel Quaritch, had been forbidden from the castle, and that intercourse between him and Ida was practically at an end. But he was a dogged and persevering man, and he knew the power of money and the shifts to which people can be driven who are made desperate by the want of it. He knew, too, that it is no unusual thing for women who are attached to one man to sell themselves to another of their own free will, realising that love may pass, but wealth, if the settlements are properly drawn, does not. Therefore, he still hoped that with so many circumstances bringing an ever-increasing pressure upon her, Ida's spirits would in time be broken, her resistance would collapse, and he would have his will. Nor, as the sequel will show, was that hope a baseless one. As for his infatuation, there was literally no limit to it. It broke out in all sorts of ways, and was for miles round a matter of public notoriety and gossip. Over the mantelpiece in his sitting room was a fresh example of it. He had by one means or another obtained several photographs of Ida, notably one of her in a court dress which she had worn 2 or 3 years before, when her brother James had insisted upon her being presented. The photographs he had caused to be enlarged, and then commissioned a well-known artist to paint from them a full-length, life-size portrait of Ida in her court dress at the cost of £500. This order had been executed, and the portrait, which, although as might be expected the colouring was not entirely satisfactory, was still an effective likeness, and a fine piece of work, now hung in a splendid frame over his mantelpiece. There, on the evening in question, he was sitting before the fire, his eyes fixed upon the portrait, of which the outline was beginning to grow dim in the waning December light, when the servant girl came in and announced that a lady wanted to speak to him. He asked what her name was, and the girl said that she did not know, because she had her veil down and was wrapped up in a big cloak. In due course the lady was shown up. He had relapsed into his reverie, for nothing seemed to interest him much now unless it had to do with Ida, and he knew that the lady was not Ida, because the girl said that she was short. As it happened, he was sitting with his right ear, in which he was stone deaf, to the door, so that between his infirmity and his dreams he never heard Bella, for it was she, enter the room. For a minute or more she stood looking at him as he sat with his eyes fixed upon the picture, and as she looked an expression of pity stole across her sweet pale face. "I wonder what curse there is laid upon us that we should be always doomed to seek for what we cannot find," she said aloud. He heard her now, and looking up saw her standing in the glow and flicker of the firelight, which played upon her white face and black draped form. He started violently, and as he did so she loosed the heavy cloak and hood that she wore, and it fell behind her. But where was the lovely rounded form, and where the clustering golden curls? Gone, and in their place a coarse robe of blue serge, on which hung a crucifix and the white hood of a nun. He sprang from his chair with an exclamation, not knowing if he dreamed or if he really saw the woman who stood there like a ghost in the firelight. "Forgive me, Edward," she said presently in her sweet low voice. "I dare say that this all looks theoretical enough, but I have put on this dress for 2 reasons. Firstly, because I have to leave this town in an hour's time and wish to do so unknown, and secondly, to show you that you need not fear that I have come to be importunate. Will you light the candles?" He did so mechanically, and then pulled down the blinds. Meanwhile Bella had seated herself near the table, her face buried in her hands. "What is the meaning of all this, Bella?" he said. "Sister Agnes, you must call me now," she said, taking her hands from her face. "The meaning of it is that I have left the world and entered a sisterhood which works among the poor in London, and that I have come to bid you farewell, a last farewell." He stared at her in amazement. He did not find it easy to connect the idea of this beautiful, passionate, human, loving creature with the cold sanctuary of a sisterhood. He did not know that it is natures like this whose very greatness and intensities are often the cause of their destruction.